So in my last video, I talked about the economy of the law and the fact that under the economy of the law, you get credit for the things that you do rightly, but you also get credit for sin. And the problem with having any credit for sin applied to your account is that any infraction of the law, the consequence is death, which means that you could have infinite number of good credits, but the consequence, the credit for sin, is still death, and no amount of good actions can outweigh death when it is on the scale. And so we talked about the economy of grace and how in the economy of grace there is neither credit for good work or bad works, and there is only credit for one thing, and that is trust. And so in this video, we're going to be breaking down, well, if everything is based in trust, then why do we make any effort whatsoever towards doing the right thing? I mean, if doing the right thing or the wrong thing gives us no advantage, we don't get credit for either in the economy of grace. And the only thing that we get credit for is our trust in Jesus. Well, then what's the point? Okay, get ready to have your mind blown. So in the Old Testament, we always heard about the law, right, was kind of part of the Old Testament. And in the New Testament, everything is done under grace. And so the conversation is, okay, well then how did trust work in the Old Testament if everything was based on the law? And this is a common misconception about how things worked in the Old Testament and what the system was in the Old Testament and how that system changed for the New Testament. So the common misconception is that people trusted in the law in the Old Testament, and the New Testament they now trust in grace. But that's inaccurate. So in the Old Testament, the law was introduced, and what the law brought was death. Now the law itself is life. This is where things get confused. The law itself is life. But for a person who is under the law, it brings death because of the fact that only one person can uphold the entirety of the law, and that is God himself. And so even though the law itself is life, for those who are under the law, it has produced death. And so in the Old Testament, it wasn't that people trusted in the law. What they actually trusted in was the way that God provided for them to live while being under the law without being judged by the law. Now, what do I mean by not being judged by the law? What I mean is that there had to be a covering, something that satisfied the legal requirements of the law that allowed the person who was living under the law to not receive the full consequence of failing to uphold it, which was death. There had to be a provision, a way in which for them to live while under the law without immediately being put to death every time they failed to uphold it. And so what was that way? Well, that way was a system of sacrifices. So in the Old Testament, the way it worked is when you sinned, you had to take from your economy, right? Something that you owned. So sometimes it was an animal, sometimes it was grain. There were lots of different types of sacrifices, and there were varying degrees of requirement based on the level of sin. So a murder required something far greater than like stealing something, right? So all these different things, they had different costs, but the costs were always something from the person's economy. Now, what that meant is that the person who sinned, they had to take from their economy, so a cow or, or money or whatever it was, right? They had to take something. It cost them something. They had to take that to the temple, and the priest would then go and make a sacrifice on their behalf. Okay, so what that sounds like is it sounds like they were buying salvation, right? They were taking something of theirs, they were offering it up, and through that process of offering, they were buying their salvation. But that's not true, because it wasn't the sacrifice that made them right before God. The thing that made them right before God was their trust in the way that God had provided. You see, the whole sacrificial system was just a forerunner for the final sacrifice that would be made by Jesus. And so the trust that the Israelites had was not in the law, because the law didn't make people righteous. Their trust was in the way in which God had provided for them to live, even though under the law they were under judgment. Okay, so what does that mean in the New Testament then? Because we're no longer under the law, we're no longer under the sacrificial system. So what does that look like in the life of a believer in the New Testament, where we no longer have to put our trust in the sacrificial system that God provided, but rather we put our trust in the final sacrifice that God provided in Jesus Christ? So then what does that look like for a believer in the New Testament then? If there's no longer a sacrificial system, right, and our trust is no longer in that way that God provided, but rather our trust is now moved to the new way which God has provided, which is trust in Jesus Christ, who is the final sacrifice. If that is where our trust is transitioned to, then how does a believer live out their life, right? Because we don't have, any time that we sin now, we don't go and provide something from our economy in order to satisfy the debt or satisfy the sacrificial system, right? Because the final sacrifice has been made. So what does that look like in the present day? All right, so check this out. So in Romans it says, I exhort you therefore, brothers, in view of God's mercies, to offer yourselves as a sacrifice, living and set apart for God. So there's two parts of this you want to pay attention to. The first part is in view of God's mercies. Now, what does that mean? Well, that means that we are taking a step back and we are looking upon the mercy that God has given us. We were deserving of death under the law. The law came, the law itself is life, but we were not able to take advantage of the law because we were bought and sold under sin. And in our own power, we could not uphold the totality of the law, which meant that even though the law was life, it still brought death for us. We all stood condemned. But God had mercy on us. God said, I love you so much that I'm not going to hold this against you. Instead, I'm going to have my son bear the load. He's going to bear the burden on your behalf. And so when he did that, he demonstrated mercy in a way that is incomprehensible. And so what is Paul saying? He's saying that in response to that mercy, instead of sacrificing animals and sacrificing our economy, we sacrificed our very lives. Now, how do we sacrifice our lives? Obviously, we don't climb up on an altar and slit our throats. That's not the sacrifice he's talking about. No, he's talking about a living sacrifice, which is what he says. He says, offer yourselves as a living sacrifice. And now, how do we offer ourselves as a living sacrifice? Well, he says right after, he says, in other words, do not let yourselves be conformed to the standards of the world that is passing away. And what does that sound like? Well, the world that is passing away has standards that say you should sleep with whoever you want. You should take advantage of whatever situation you need to take advantage of in order to gain an advantage in life, whether it be economic or whether it be social, whatever it is. You should do what's good for you. That's the system that we are all born into. And so Paul says that we lay all of that down. We lay down our desires. We lay down our hopes. We lay down our dreams. We lay down the ways in which we used to go about getting money, the ways in which we used to go about getting pleasure. All of those things, we lay them all down. We separate ourselves from those things for God. And then we allow God to show us the way that we ought to live. And why do we do this? We do this in response to the mercy that has already been given. And so in the old system, in the system of sacrifices, when we made a mistake, we would then go and our act of trust in God was to go and give from our economy to the priests so that they would sacrifice on our behalf. And so our trust in God was demonstrated after we had already sinned. But in the New Testament, what shifts is that it's a reversal. The mercy has already come. The demonstration of love and grace has already come. And so we don't sacrifice because we've sinned. Rather, in response to the fact that our sins have been forgiven, in response to God, we live a life that is worthy of the forgiveness that he bought and paid for us. It would be like if you went to a doctor after smoking for 30 years, right? And the doctor says to you, listen, the smoking has created an aggressive cancer. And the rest of your days, you're going to live for probably another 20 or so years. But the next 20 or so years of your life are going to be excruciatingly painful. And every day, you're going to be moving closer and closer to death. And when the time comes for you to die, you are going to die a death that is so painful that it is absolutely unimaginable. And to be honest, it would probably be better for you to take your own life than to endure it because of how awful it's going to be. And so you find yourself sitting there devastated at the prospect of what your future holds. And the doctor, moved in compassion, says, listen, I may have a cure. I'm going to need you to come back in a week and I'll let you know. And so you go home, and for a week you grieve. You grieve the life that's ahead of you. You grieve the life that you live. You grieve the fact that you've brought yourself to this place, that your actions have led to this moment where the consequences have caught up, and now your future is nothing but pain and misery. But you trust the doctor and you believe him when he says that there may be a cure. And so a week later, you go back to his office to visit him. And the doctor walks into the room and he has a bag of blood. And he says, listen, I have a cure. It's in this bag right here. What it's going to cost is a transfusion. And we're going to have to take all of the blood out of your entire body. We're going to have to replace it with the blood that's in this bag. But if we do that, you will live. And you will avoid all of the pain that's ahead of you. And I'm going to give it to you for free. And of course, in that moment, you're overjoyed because your prospects, your future has been given back to you. Hope has been returned. And so you jump onto the table, you lay down immediately, you hook up to the IV, and you let the doctor run the transfusion. And so finally, as the transfusion, the new blood is pumping through your body, you can literally feel the cancer healing within you. You can feel all of the rot starting to come off. You feel stronger, you feel invigorated, you feel better than you felt in the last 20 years of your life. And so after a while, the bag finally is emptied and all of the old blood is gone, and you look over and you see in the bag where your blood was, it's just boiling and tar and corrupt and disgusting and filthy. And you think to yourself, how could that have possibly been in me? How was I even living with that in me? But you're overjoyed because your hope's been returned, your future has been returned. And so you jump up off the table and you get ready to go, and you pause for a moment. You look back over your shoulder to the doctor and you say, Doc, I mean, you have a cure to cancer. This is amazing. Why, where did you get that blood from? And the look on the doctor's face is full of pain and sadness. He takes a few steps back and pulls a curtain. And behind the curtain, there's a table. And on the table, you can tell that there's a small body laying on the table, and it's covered with a sheet. And you feel confused for a moment, though. You're thinking, oh, maybe there was a donor or something that had this miracle blood. Like, how did any of this work? And you can tell that the doctor is clearly bothered. And so you ask him, you say, Doc, like who was that? Like, how, where did that come from? How was that possible? And the doctor says, well, it was my son. He was born with a very special and rare blood type. He was truly a one of a kind. And when we heard your story, we were moved by it, and he offered to give you his blood. And that's the blood that's coursing through your veins right now and keeping you alive. And so as you sat there dumbfounded, looking at this lifeless body and the sadness on the man's face who just gave up everything for you to live, you look at him and you say, how do I repay you? What can I offer? How do I I don't even know what to pay. And he just looks at you with soft eyes and he smiles. And he says, just don't waste it. Just don't waste it. This is why we live rightly. This is why we conduct ourselves in a way that is worthy of the sacrifice that he made for us, for the mercy that he bought for us. This is why we live rightly. Even though we are in the economy of grace, where neither our good or our evil is credited to our account, only our trust that the blood is enough to heal us. We live rightly because we need to live lives that are worthy of the price that he paid.